God is joyful. Man was created to rejoice in his beauty. This much is clear in Edward's writings. In a way, this discovery works like a theological Copernican revolution of sorts, forming a new center in our understanding of the very nature of God himself. Rather than a stodgy, bitter God, cosmically folding his arms and looking upon the world in disdain, Edwards paints a portrait of God that is consistently biblical and yet shockingly beautiful. He says in one place, "When we speak of God's happiness, the account that we are wont to give of it is that God is infinitely happy in the enjoyment of himself, in perfectly beholding and infinitely loving and rejoicing in his own essence and perfections." Sean Michael Lucas, aptly summarizing Edwards' Trinitarian theology, says succinctly, "God's own happiness is at the very center of who God is." While God's holy wrath, as portrayed in Edwards' sermon Sinners, is sadly lacking in the preaching of some evangelical churches today, a fault that can only be repaired with a return to biblical exposition, it can also be said that God's joy is missing as well. To borrow an Edwardsian illustration, preaching a God without joy is like attempting to describe the sun without discussing its light. If the heat of the sun corresponds to his holiness, which, by the way, demands obedience and makes necessary God's wrath, a description of the central star in our orbit could not possibly be complete without describing joy as the very light that brightens the solar system. Edwards' theology of God's happiness is also a helpful counterbalance to the so-called health and wellness gospel, also known as the prosperity gospel. This version of Christianity, portrayed by such well-known contemporary advocates as Joel Osteen, Paula White, Joyce Meyer, and Bishop Eddie Long, among others, argues relentlessly for the happiness of mankind, but does so in a way that would be completely foreign to Jonathan Edwards. Namely, the centrality of God's glory seems to be missing. They often speak of being happy, being successful, or being free, but then ground that same happiness in the temporal circumstances of this life, rather than in the eternal promises of the gospel. Most often, they merge and equate temporal, circumstantial success with spiritual happiness. These modern preachers have far more in common with their secular Enlightenment Age forefathers, whose entire cosmology was thoroughly anthropomorphic, than they do with the older Reformation heritage and Puritan-modeled evangelical Christianity, which consistently makes God the theological center. Where modern humanistic preaching goes wrong is when it begins with man's happiness and makes it entirely circumstantial, that is, based on whether or not he is in good health, a state of employment, and relational peace with others. Though all these things are important, of course, they make the error that Edwards worked so hard to correct. They begin with man's joy, the water, and fail to return to the divine source, the fountain. The glory of God, as a central galvanizing principle in the theology of Joel Osteen, for instance, appears to be utterly lacking, as his teaching is devoid of rich Trinitarian reflection, a probing analysis of God's redemptive purposes in creation, or the biblical doctrines of grace sewn so persuasively into every sermon of Jonathan Edwards. Much of what passes for evangelical doctrine today is not much more than thinly veiled self-help principles for building a better life for oneself, centered more on pragmatic methodology and popular-level psychology, rather than any attempt to delve into the orthodox mysteries of the Trinity. Stephen Nichols, summarizing the view of God that Edwards held, says rightly, I think, "God's wrath is in proportion to his love. As exceeding and abundant as his love is, so too is God's wrath. We much prefer to think of God's love, but we must see God in the fullness of his self-revelation." Moreover, we find that Jonathan Edwards' balance between God's holiness, with its corresponding necessity of wrath against sin, and God's joy, made known through the gospel of Jesus Christ and the indwelling power of the Holy Spirit, are well balanced in Edwards' thought. Reading Jonathan Edwards is, therefore, a helpful corrective to both a stilted conception of God and an anthropologically centered and pragmatic approach to Christianity, which focuses on circumstantial happiness rather than a joy founded in the greatness and glory of God.